Well, something a little different today. Most of you probably know I don't use slides, so I'm giving that a go. I've had some requests, so it's easier for people to take notes of the reference. I actually find them quite distracting as a presenter, but we'll see how I go. I'm going to try to learn some new skills. But last time I stood before you here, we spoke of the book of James. We started our study through that, and we got through the first 2 chapters of the book of James. Today we're going to look at chapter 3, and if we have time, we'll make our way into the beginning of chapter 4. But just in summary of the first 2 chapters, we looked at the need of patience and wisdom. We looked at the source of temptation, and we discussed, do temptations come from God or from Satan or both? And we learned something interesting because in chapter 1, verse 13, it says, "Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God." But we learnt in Genesis 22, verse 1, that God tempted Abraham. And it seemed like a contradiction. But we concluded that when it uses the term that God tempted, it's God providing us opportunity to obey him, not an attempt to cause us to disobey. As where when Satan tempts us, he is trying to draw us away from obeying God. So they're going in different directions. We learnt that we need to do as well as to hear, to have works and not just faith. And chapter 2 focused largely on a warning against being a respecter of persons. And we do circle back around to that idea in chapter 3. But before we dive into chapter 3, let us take our minds back to the 2 hymns that we sung this morning and some of the words. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go, anywhere he leads me in this world below. Anywhere without him, dearest friend, joys would fade. Anywhere with Jesus I am not afraid. Would you go anywhere with Christ and have no fear? Could you imagine some places that might scare you, but you would sort of tempt to go if you knew that God was guiding or leading? I think of Bible stories. You've got Daniel with lions, and you've got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with a fire. And there's many other stories and examples. Joseph went into prison because he chose to honor God. What if we turn our minds to our first hymn, and it says, "I trust in God wherever I may be, upon the land or on the rolling sea." Now, the Apostle Paul spent some time at sea. He was shipwrecked several times. Would you go out to sea in a perilous situation and risk your life? Is that something that you would be afraid to do? I think I probably would. I'm a reasonably good swimmer, but open ocean is a very different story. I came across something in the last weeks that really piqued my interest. These gentlemen here decided to stow away on the rudder of a cargo ship so that they could move countries. Would you stow away on the rudder of a cargo ship to travel along the coast of Australia or the coast of another country? Danny?
No, because the rudder is not always up there.
It's not always. Sometimes it's underneath, yeah. And if you were quite adventurous, maybe along the coast of Australia where you could still see land, you'd say, I'd give it a go. These gentlemen didn't follow the coast. They crossed the Atlantic. They spent 14 days on the back of this rudder, traveling from Nigeria to Brazil. 3,500 miles and 2 weeks. I don't know how they made it. As Danny pointed out, sometimes that rudder is submerged. I have heard that where the rudder connects to the ship, there's a bit of a well there that they could climb up into. But this to me is something that I don't think I would attempt. But these people decided that they wanted a better life and they would try this. They made it to Brazil. The authorities found them. The photo prior to this one on your left showed a Coast Guard from the Brazilian Navy handing them some water and food to sort of survive. But we will come back around to rudders a little later on because they come up in chapter 3. But as we start our journey, let us look at James chapter 3 and verse 1. And we read, "My brethren, be not masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation." The word masters here actually talks about teachers, instructors, overseers of large numbers of people. You see here somebody in front of a university. I couldn't begin to make out what he's written on the board there. But he is responsible for the learning and the education of all those people. And if, for example, they were engineers and their education was flawed and buildings collapsed, the responsibility could go back to him as their instructor. So we're given warning in James chapter 3 and verse 1 that if we are masters over many, that our condemnation or the judgment upon us will be greater because of that influence and the instruction that we have given. In verse 2, it poses an idea that really stood out to me because in this day and age, the idea of being offended is one that people take seriously. James chapter 3 and verse 2, we'll read the first part. "For in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man." Now you just have to look at society today. In America they have the First Amendment. We don't have the same sort of legislation here in Australia, but that gives them the freedom of speech, freedom of press. They can express their ideas freely. But you can see that there are attempts to restrict that, because now they introduce hate speech laws, where simply expressing an idea that others disagree with can be considered violence and offensive. And people think that they have a right not to be offended, as where the First Amendment says that you actually have a right to be offended, to have that robust conversation and sharing of ideas. Can we offend people? According to this verse, it says, "For in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, he is perfect." We're called to be perfect. Does that mean that we need to be careful not to offend somebody in our speech? It's an interesting thought. How can we express our ideas, our opinion, have a robust conversation about Scripture if we cannot risk offending somebody? Well, the word offend is an interesting one because it came up in chapter 2. But here is a dictionary definition. Now, this comes from a dictionary specifically put together for the King James Version Bible. So it's definition of words as they meant in 1611 when the King James Bible was compiled. And the word here, offend, is translated from a word which means to transgress the moral or divine law, to sin or to commit a crime. So that's a different meaning to the word offend than to hurt somebody's feelings because you express an idea that they don't like. This is reinforced by James chapter 2, verses 9 through 10. If we turn our Bibles back to James chapter 2, we start with verse 9. It says, "But if you have respect to persons, you commit sin." So we're not to respect people. "And are convicted of the law as transgressors. For whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend, there's that word again, in one point is guilty of all. So these verses seem contradictory with verse 2 of chapter 3, unless you have this understanding of what it means or what the word offend is translated from. You have an image here of a blindfolded woman holding some scales and a sword. Does anybody know what this represents or what her name may be?
He's a judge.
Pardon?
A judge.
A judge? Not quite, but it does have to do with the law. She is known as Lady Justice. And the idea is that the sword is because she is there for judgment. The scales is because she has to weigh the facts of any given situation. And she's blindfolded for a very particular reason. Now, some statues show her without the blindfold, but the blindfold is there because she is not to show favoritism to anybody because of their social status or whatever it may be. So she is to execute justice without fear or favour of who the parties are. That is the same idea presented in chapter 2, verse 9 that we read. But if ye have respect to persons, you commit sin. If we make a decision based on somebody's social status or their friendship or connection with us or to somebody we know, or maybe that there might be some retribution that we don't like, so we'll just divert our judgment from justice a little, then we commit sin. So we're called to form an opinion, to make judgment without fear or favour, rightly weighing the facts. In a scriptural term, the words used is the word of truth. Reading on in verse 2, it says, speaking of the man who doesn't offend in word, the same as a perfect man and able to bridle the whole body. He's able to bridle the whole body. This is a bridle on a horse here. Now it's got two parts. This one has the reins and everything, but we come across a word a little later on that talks about we putting bits in horses' mouths. If you can see the steel ring near the mouth of the horse, it actually has a metal piece that goes through its mouth and across its tongue and connects the two sides. So a bridle itself, in its simplest forms, does not have the reins or that metal piece. It's just the leather strapping that goes over the horse's head. But it says that if we offend not in words, if we do not commit sin in word, we are able to bridle our entire body. It goes on in verse 3 that we put bits in horses' mouths, that's the bit that we looked at there, that they may obey us, and we turn the whole body. You've seen, or many of us I'm sure have seen, people riding horses, may have even ridden horses ourselves. But have you ever seen either an artist's depiction or maybe in cinema or the like, horses are trained at times to charge headlong into battle, into gunfire or cannon fire. This was before the day of mechanical warfare the way we know it now. So they are trained and they put bits in their mouths that they can steer them in whatever direction they like, even if it might be perilous to their own detriment. But we're told that if we offend not in word, we're able to do the same for our entire body, to steer it in any direction that we like. We circle back to ships in verse 4. Behold also the ship, which though they be so great and are driven of fierce winds, yet they are turned about with a very small helm, wheresoever the governor listeth. Governor, we would say captain these days, but look at the size of the steering wheel that he has there. It's smaller than a car. Some people went go-karting the other week prior to the wedding. I haven't been for a while, but those steering wheels I think are a little smaller than usual. But this tiny little wheel is what controls a massive ship, similar to the one that these gentlemen we looked at the beginning crossed the Atlantic Ocean on. So that little wheel turns this rudder, which turns an entire ship. To the point where, back in ancient times, when James would have written this, ships would have had a till as a rudder. So you might have seen a small rowboat where you've got the same rudder in the water, but there's a little handle that people use to move around to steer it left to right. Or the powered motorboat, that same till is now connected to an outboard motor that you turn to steer direction. But they were driven by wind. They weren't diesel or petrol powered the way we have ships today. To the point where a skilled sailor could use the rudder and the wind power to actually sail into the wind. It seems counterintuitive to head in a direction that seems impossible because you've got this small device of control. Now, you can't head directly into the wind. What the sail ship does is it sits at about 40 degrees from the wind. So if you were to imagine straight ahead being your 12 o'clock on a clock, at the number 2 on your right hand as your arm goes around, that's approximately 40 degrees to the wind. Maybe actually it's a bit more than that to get to 40 degrees. But in that general area, if the wind comes from that direction, you can sail the boat on a slight angle to the wind. And they would sail to the left, they'd change direction and sail to the right, and they'd sail in this zigzag pattern so that they're actually traveling directly in the direction the wind is coming from. So James is using this terminology of steering horses in whatever direction we like because they are trained and we have this bridle on them and we put bits in their mouths, and that we can steer ships directly into the wind with this tiny steering device because of the skill that we have. And he uses that to liken it to the tongue, to say that if we are able to control our speech, not to the point where we don't offend others' opinions, but to the point where we do not break the law of God and sin, that we're able to control the whole body. So this infers, and it is brought out later in the chapter, that the tongue, it's made up of approximately 8 muscles, there's no bones, but the tongue in our body, it's such a small percentage of our body by size or weight, but is something that controls our entire direction. We've heard the saying that we should be a man or a woman of our word. So what we say is what we should do. Are there times when our tongue could get us into trouble because we make a commitment or we say something and later on we sort of have to follow through or recant to turn away from the decision we've made, where we've said something maybe in haste or anger because somebody has annoyed us, perhaps on the road or at work. We've said something and later on thought, I shouldn't have said that. It's because the tongue has the power to steer our entire body in a given direction, to shape our character and who we become. Who knows what this creature is? I'll give you a hint. It's a snail. It looks submerged, so it's a snail within the ocean. This creature has a very interesting tongue. But before we get to its tongue, let us continue our reading from verse 5 of chapter 3. Even so the tongue is a little member that boasteth great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. So is the tongue among our members, that it defileth the whole body, and set on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire of hell. There are some powerful words. But nations have gone to war over what started out as a heated conversation, a differences of opinion. People couldn't negotiate and come to to terms, so they decided to go to war. Or back in more ancient times, I don't believe it happens today, at least not in Western society, people would go out and duel because someone was offended. They would either have swords or pistols. They would go out and duel potentially to the death because somebody was offended by what somebody else said. Imagine offending somebody and they challenged you to a duel because you didn't like their outfit or said that they were poor in business or that they didn't honor their word. They challenged you to a duel, and out of honor, you accepted. So you go out and put your life at risk over a few words. We read on in verse 7, "For every kind of beast and of birds and of serpents and of things in the sea is tamed and hath been tamed of mankind. But the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison." Now there are 2 points in this last verse. It says that no man can tame the tongue. But we read in verse 2 that if any man doesn't offend in word, he's perfect. So these verses are telling us that you can't tame your tongue, at least not with your own strength or ability. But the second part of this verse said that the tongue is full of deadly poison. This sea creature here is a cone snail. I didn't know, but they exist in Australia. Anyone who's gone snorkeling in the tropics along the Great Barrier Reef may have even seen some of them. We may have inadvertently picked up empty shells of these cone snails along the beach. But I learnt something about these creatures that will make me think twice when picking up a shell that is shaped like a cone. A saying was developed, if it's shaped like a cone, leave it alone. And that's because this creature has a tongue. The tongue is the long one at the bottom. Above that is a device called a siphon, is essentially like a nose. It can smell through it. But this fish here, this sea creature, it's not a fish, I guess you'd call it a shellfish of sorts. This snail, it has a tongue that shoots out a barbed harpoon. Not only that, inside it, it has a gland that mixes poisons and toxins together to the point where it can create more than 100 different concoctions of poison depending on what it is hunting. Whether it's hunting fish, whether it's defending itself from a predator. It builds up this toxin as a pressure in the back of this long tongue, and when the sensors at the tip of the tongue notice that this creature is within range, it releases that pressure and it fires this harpooned dart into that creature, followed along with all the poison and toxins. Some species, the poison and toxin is more than enough to kill a human. And because it mixes them internally, there is no known concoction because you don't know how it's put this batch of chemicals together for this particular attempt to defend itself or to attack prey. So this creature has a tongue that is full of deadly poison that can kill. This is a creature that I came across actually some months ago purely by chance, and it came back to mind when I was reading these verse in chapter 8 of James, verse 8 of James chapter 3, when it says that the tongue is full of deadly poison. Now I have a note beside that verse in my Bible saying cone snail. My mind is always going to go back to this creature. But is our tongue like this? Not one that shoots out barbs with poison following as a form of liquid. But is our tongue full of poison in the way we speak to others, be it within our family, within our work circle, within our church family? Is there rifts and disputes because of words said from decades past? Words said in haste, maybe without thinking. Maybe there was truth behind them, but just the way those words were framed were, a little harsher than need to be. Or were those words spoken in kindness, although truthful, and we chose to be offended by them for whatever the reason be, and have decided that they were poisonous? So keep in mind what words can do and the poison that a tongue can bring. We continue on. It talks about out of the mouth, this is verse 10. Verse 9, we'll paraphrase and go into verse 10, that we bless God and we curse man with the same tongue, but that God created man in his image. Verse 10 tells us that out of the same mouth proceeds blessings and cursings, that it shouldn't be like this. And it poses a question in verse 12, can the fig tree bear olive berries or olives? Or the vine figs? These verses go back to, we'll come back to that one. These verses go back to what is said in Matthew 7, verse 16 through 20. And in paraphrasing those ideas, Christ said, by their fruit you will know them. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes, figs from thistles? He says, every man is known by his fruits. So it can be inferred by bringing these verses together that our speech is a type of fruit that people can know us by. If we were to circle back to these verses here that I skipped over, in Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 20, we're told that there are 6 things that God hates. And it goes on to say that 7 are an abomination. We'll quickly flip to them in Proverbs chapter 6. And I want you to count as I read them how many of these 7 in total, so 6 God hates, 7 are an abomination, how many of them involve the tongue? Proverbs chapter 6 and beginning with verse 16. These 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. 1, a proud look. 2, a lying tongue. 3, hands that shed innocent blood. 4, a heart that deviseth wicked imaginations. 5, feet that are swift in running to mischief. 6, a false witness that speaketh lies. 7, he that soweth discord among brethren. How many of those involve the tongue? 3. So almost half. 3 out of 7. Almost half. When it says that there are 6 things that God hates and the 7th is an abomination, almost half of them involve our speech. No wonder it says that the tongue can be full of deadly poison. In this image here, it shows 2 seas meeting. This is the Pacific and not the Atlantic, Indian Oceans. This is at the bottom of South Africa, the tip of, I think it's Good Hope in South Africa, Cape of Good Hope. I was there visiting many, many years ago. This is not a photo that I have taken, although I did take some photos while I was there. And here you see 2 oceans meeting, but they're not exactly mixing very well, are they? There's 2 reasons for this. One is temperature differences. But the greater reason is the salinity levels of the water, the saltiness. You could probably look up online if you've ever seen pictures, maybe in a science experiment. They mix fresh water and salty water together, but at different temperatures. And they separate like water and oil. And you can see them there sitting in 2 distinct ways because of the different salt content and the different temperatures. And here we see that on a larger scale when two oceans are trying to unite together. And it's this same idea that's presented in James, because it says, where was it? Verse 11. Doth a fountain send forth at the same place sweet and bitter water? It doesn't. Where a river runs into the ocean, unless there's a waterfall or something to stop the salt coming back up, you get to an area that's got brackish water. It is a mixture of salt and fresh water. It's not quite seawater, but it's not fresh water either. But a fountain or a stream at a given location, it doesn't bring forth both at the same place. They don't mix well. And it's again an image that James uses to visualize this idea of our speech and using our tongue to bless and to curse, and that we can't be righteous or just if our speech swings backwards and forwards between these. James 3:17, it comes back to this idea of Lady Justice. It says, but the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. So we don't speak in a hypocritical way, but again, we don't speak impartially. We keep the same standard, the standard of truth, regardless of who it is that we're speaking to. We'll briefly look at the beginning of James chapter 4 as we conclude this morning. James chapter 4, we'll read through the first, say 4 verses, maybe paraphrase a few more than that. But the word lust comes up here several times. But there are actually 2 words that are translated to lust here. So without understanding those 2 words, we don't get the deeper meaning behind it. It says, from whence come wars and fightings among you? Why are you arguing? Why are there differences of opinion? Come they not hence, even of your lusts, that war in your members? Ye lust and have not, ye kill and desire to have, and cannot obtain. Ye fight and have war, yet have not, because ye ask not. Ye ask and receive not, because ye ask amiss, that ye may consume it upon your lusts. So it's using the word lust here several times over, and it's oscillating backwards and forwards between some of these ideas, because it's saying that you lust and you have not, that you don't have because you don't ask, but when you do ask, you don't get it because you want to use it on your lusts. The first word, lust, there is a negative. It's like a sinful kind of lust. When it says that you lust and have not, that word lust comes from a neutral word, meaning that you have desire, but it could be good or bad. It doesn't specify, where the first lust comes from a word that is a negative, to lust after something that is bad. The third lust, when it says that you may consume it upon your lust, is again that negative word for lust. So we've got 2 negatives, a positive or a neutral, I should say, in the middle. So if we look at these verses with that in mind, it says that there are wars or strife among you because of your lusts, your negative desires, whether that be for supremacy, to be rich, to be more prominent than the next person, to have other types of lust, whether they be sensual or the like, but a negative lust. So you have strife among you because you have negative desires that you are pursuing. It says that ye lust or ye desire and have not. So you have desires, and some of those desires may be good, but you're not receiving. And we get clarity later on. It says that ye kill and desire to have. That word desire there is very similar to the word lust that we read that is neutral, and cannot obtain. Ye fight and war because ye have not. And it goes on to say, because we want to use what we've asked for upon our lusts. Now, a situation came to mind, a biblical example came to mind, and it actually reminded me somewhat of myself, because for those of you who don't know, I have two middle names, which is a little uncommon. Some people have none or one. But I have two. My first middle name is my father's first name, which is James. And my second middle name is my great-grandfather's middle name, which is John. His name was Robert John. So my middle name is James John. Now that's interesting because there was a couple of brothers in the Bible named James and John. And they were known as the sons of thunder. And I probably behaved a little bit like that in my younger youth. But these two gentlemen, as I will call them, at the time they may not have been, but these two gentlemen were offended in the scripture. And they went to Christ and they said, Lord, shall we call fire down from heaven to consume them? Now, calling fire from heaven is not necessarily a bad thing. Elijah did it on Mount Carmel. But here, James and John have gone, can we call fire down to get rid of these people that have offended us? So they desired something that may be neutral in and of itself, but they wanted to consume that desire on something negative to get rid of these people that upset them. And that's the idea that's being presented here by James when he said that ye lust and desire, both in a neutral sense, that you may consume these on your lusts, on your negative desires. So it's like us going to God, asking for a good thing. Lord, I want you to grant me wealth, for example. Now that could be a good thing. We could use it to do a lot of missionary work. But you want that wealth so that you can drive around in a very expensive car or wear expensive jewelry or whatever it might be so that people will be impressed by you. So you're asking for something that's neutral in and of itself, but you're asking so that you can use it on something that is negative. And it says that's why you're not being granted your desires, because you want them to use them in a negative way. So when we ask God for things, let us think of how we want to use them. Are we asking so we can use them for His glory, or are we asking them of Him so we can consume them on our own lusts? When we speak, and this goes back to that beginning where it says that if any man offend not in word, he is perfect. When we speak, can we take that moment to think what impact our words might have, for positive or for negative, and how far into the future that impact might go? I've heard stories of people who have had a stranger say a kind word in passing, and later on they've said that I was going to go and kill myself because I thought life was worthless. But the kindness shown me by this stranger in a small act or deed spoken caused me to change my mind. That person didn't know what a few words could change. Or others, there was a situation within the last week or two where a man went through a drive-through in America, a drive-through fast food restaurant. Some of you may have come across it in the news. But this person, for whatever reason, we don't know, they may have had a mental health situation, but this person was wearing a t-shirt or a top, and I believe they were sitting there in their underwear, but in this car. They looked to be in their late 20s or early 30s. The person at the window serving noticed this and decided to film them and post it online. And they said, "Why are you driving around like this?" The person, seen themselves being filmed, sped off without their order, and later on went to a car park somewhere and shot themselves. They took their own life. All because the person seen this situation and decided to record it and share it with the world and say, why are you doing this? Now, we don't know the person's motives, whether they were innocent and there was a mental health situation going on. We don't know if there was, malice or something sinister in their actions. We don't know. All we know is that this person was dealt with in a way and words were spoken that caused them to take their own life several hours later. Our tongue can have a deadly poison in it. So let us remember that our words carry meaning and power. They can be a savour of life unto life and hasten Christ's return. It can be a means to win souls to Him, but it can also be used as a weapon to turn people away from Him, even unknowingly. So let us remember to be mindful of our speech and our actions and what we ask God for. Amen.